All right, no more stragglers, so I think we can get started. So I'd just like to welcome everybody to my talk, Efficiency is Everything, Managing the Development Pipeline of an MMORTS. I'm going to talk to you about what's bad process, what's good process, and how we manage things on the Battle Pirates team to optimise our efficiency. First off, why are we here? We all know making games is complex, it's pretty obvious. There's no silver bullet for process. I'm sure you're all familiar with Agile, Kanban, Scrum. All of these things don't necessarily always apply, and it really depends on what your actual goals are. Inefficiency is waste. Waste is missed opportunity. If you spend too much time working on something right up to the last minute, and then delivering it too late, and you miss out on an opportunity like packs, if you miss out on having a video prepared, something like that, you're missing out a real good opportunity for your game to make real profits. I think we can all agree that process is critically important. So some background on me. I've been making games for about 10 years now, various lead roles as an engineer, 7+ games. The last 5 years working at KIXEYE on Battle Pirates, and I've worked both remotely from Melbourne and in the San Francisco office. So what is Battle Pirates? It's a bit of a special beast. It's a 6+ years live MMORTS, so it's played on Facebook, various other web platforms. KIXEYE has their own website, which you can access it, and in it, players effectively build ships, fight one of each other, generally cause a lot of mayhem. It's we classify it as a mid-core kind of game. Importantly, we have major events every month, as well as weekly activities, so we need to keep constant content coming into the game to keep our players satisfied and engaged. We have a 20 to 30 person team, combined of all of the usual people you'd expect, product managers, data analysts, all of these things. And the size of the team, it can be pretty complex to try and get them all organised to deliver on those weekly releases. So when I first joined, where was our process? We had what I would call a prototyping methodology. They'd really built the game quickly to get it to market. We wanted to see if it would succeed without investing too much effort. So we'd really kind of had this prototyping approach to things. Features were decided at the last minute. Monday rolls in, we say, what are we building this week? What do we want to release for our players? Effectively assign all of our engineers on things and say, go. The roadmap was pretty much determined without cost of the resourcing for that. One of my favourite stories is we were all heads down for about a month on a major feature for the game, and we were working really hard to get it finished up. And then we rolled out of that, finally pushed it out, turned around and said, all right, what's next? We had 6 features that were coming out in the next 2 weeks that all required a back-end engineer, and at the time we only had 1 back-end engineer. So as you can imagine, it was pretty chaotic. Thankfully, we've come a very long way since then. So what is bad process? Well, it's easy to identify the symptoms of bad process. It's chaos, confusion, if you've got people running around not sure what they're supposed to be doing, it's crunch, you're working late, no one likes that. You're missing the deadlines and not actually getting the things you need, and then obviously poor quality results, which is you do get something, but it's not really what you wanted, and it can actually be negative to actually release that kind of content. More importantly, though, is what makes it bad. It's really a lack of structure. You don't have people knowing what they're supposed to be working on. You don't have a good plan for what's coming up. It's contrary to goals. Your team really needs to have goals of what you're trying to achieve, and a process that doesn't aim you towards hitting those goals isn't really achieving what you need it to be. And importantly, no consistency. If your process only works half the time, then it doesn't work. You should just ditch it. I think an important thing to remember is overcomplication of process. Now, rigidity, preventing the adaptation to opportunities. That happens where you've got, say, things where we have to enter a ticket, a dev has to work on it, QA has to sign off on it, it has to be merged across to the branch. All of these things are good process, but sometimes they can prevent you from rapidly getting something out that's really going to move the needle and maybe getting players to invest in your game. And then obviously, overhead, process for process sake. I'm sure we've all experienced that as well. You're just running through things, jumping through hoops, not really doing anything, attending a lot of meetings. All of that's pretty bad. So what is good process? We like to refer to it as a guiding light in service to team goals. Now, the reason we call it that is because it's not necessarily rigid and structured, but when you're working, you should use it as a guide to say, you know, are we following our process? Are we hitting our deadlines? Are we delivering the things we need to deliver? For us, we define a number of goals to what we're hoping to achieve with that process. Flexibility. It's crucially important for a game like Battle Pirates, which is live, to be able to release things at any time, fix bugs, all of those kind of things, maximize opportunities depending on what user behavior is telling us is occurring. Predictability. What can we actually do? When will it actually be ready? There's no point having a roadmap that says this is when we're going to release everything if you can't hit it. Consistency. We want to be able to make sure that our process is applying to everything that we do on Battle Pirates. And efficiency. Are we achieving the most that we possibly can? You don't want people jumping through hoops. You don't want to miss opportunities again by wasting time. And then the last important metric for process is success. All too often you'll have people say, oh, we need to follow this particular methodology to hit what we want to release. But if that is actually preventing you from making a lot of money or something like that, sometimes you have to be able to flex and achieve that through modifying your process. So, what makes planning hard? Staffing. You've got all of the different disciplines you need to deal with. Each of them have to be coordinated and working together. For us, there's a split focus. We need to plan ahead for what we want coming up. We're developing the existing features now that we're going to release shortly, and then we're also dealing with the live issues that crop up on the game. All three of those things need to be dealt with simultaneously. Unpredictable results and changes. We release features sometimes, player behavior goes the opposite direction we anticipated. Thankfully it doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, we need to be able to move rapidly. And I think deliverables in development are at loggerheads. As I was saying before, often you've got a roadmap that your product manager set that says we need to release this week, the next week, so forth. And then the development time says, well, it's going to take me 4 weeks to do the first one, 1 week to do the next one, 3 weeks to do the latter one. So how do we solve these problems on Battle Pirates? As I was saying, live games have a slightly different development requirement because we're not really prototyping so much or building a big game aiming for a particular release. We're really supporting something that's actively running. So we track all of the things that we're adding to the game as what we call features. So this could be content, and we're adding a new event for players to participate in, new prizes for them to win, or systems. It could be tech debt. Things where we say moving something that was previously client authoritative to server authoritative. All of these things are tracked as individual features, and every feature has a product owner that effectively is the one making the final call on any questions that arise on that. We use a mix of kind of agile and waterfall methodology. Because we don't go full agile because we have much more rigid constraints about what we're hoping to achieve in terms of a deadline or roadmap. So we go with a kind of a mix of that and waterfall. And to achieve all of it, we divide everything into multiple levels. So the high level consists of our long-term planning. We try and plan out at least 3 months in advance. And the low level is kind of the individual feature development, which is the week-to-week thing and actually hitting those releases. We use a matrixed organisational structure. So I'm not sure if you're all familiar with this, but effectively we have different disciplines all reporting into a lead. The lead's really responsible for career growth and just overseeing those particular requirements of that discipline. They're kind of the last call. They can step in if that person's unavailable, that kind of thing. But more importantly, we break our features into sub-teams. So effectively we'll have a product manager and an engineer working on one feature, another product manager and a designer, engineer, artist working on a separate feature, and then again a separate one where it might be a designer, an engineer and an artist, and maybe the head of the discipline is actually the feature owner for that particular issue. One thing it's important to avoid with a matrix kind of setup like this is you want the mixed management issues where someone comes to you and says, I don't know who's supposed to be telling me what I'm doing. Is it my boss, the lead of my discipline, or is it the feature owner? For us, we effectively defer to the feature owners on most things. So, high level, we perform quarterly planning. We do it pretty regularly. We review it once a month. It's a guide for us of what's coming up. It's a planning thing where we sit down with all of the leads and we say, what are all the features we want to release in the next 3 months? What do we need to get out? What are our repetitive features that we do all the time, events, weekly FMs, things like that? And during that time, we'll kind of have a brief discussion about what's involved in the individual features we're developing, and do what we call a WAG, which is a wild ass guess, which is I'll look at it and say, I think that's probably 2 weeks of client engineers work. Maybe we'll say it's 3 weeks of design, that kind of stuff. At that point, we're not really interested in too much specifics. We'll discuss it across a number of meetings to try and narrow it down to be loosely accurate, but at that point, we're not locking these things in. We're just saying, what do we want to do? And importantly, do we have space for it? Often these meetings, we come in with a lot of features and we end up with about twice the amount of work that we actually have staff to implement. And at that point, we kind of do a value analysis of each feature. What is it going to bring to us? Is it crucial for the ongoing success of the Battle Pirates team? And then we'll cut features or talk about limiting the scope of particular features in order to get a pretty much a loose capacity planning. So as you can see here, it's kind of we sum up our total amount and compare that to how many weeks of time we have available from our developers. From that, we have what we call the mid-level or the roadmap planning. So on Battle Pirates, we aim to have 6 weeks of a predictable roadmap, which is if we put something on that roadmap, we're going to hit it. Consequently, we have to be very careful about what goes on that roadmap. At this point, the feature owner for all of these things will have written a more detailed brief of what's actually involved in the system. And at that point, we can do a SWAG, which is a scientific wild-ass guess. At this point, it's still a guess. The reason we emphasize this so strongly is because we want to avoid people looking at this and saying, this is locked in, this is on our roadmap, we have to do this. By kind of treating it in that kind of guess kind of or terminology, we're encouraging people to not say this is what we absolutely have to do. Practice makes perfect. Your heads of your disciplines will get pretty good at guessing these swags over time. Occasionally there's mistakes, but it's not too bad. Generally, we pad all of our estimates in this case. If I look at a feature and I say that's going to be 3.5 weeks, I'll go to 4. If I think it's right on 3 weeks, I might go to 4 anyway. That's because it's so much easier to shrink down time. If you finish something early, there's always 1,000 other things that you can put that developer on. But if you underestimate, then you're stuck. And at this point, we also determine the individuals who are going to be working on each of these features. We don't have fixed teams. Teams shift around as needed. The main reason for this is different people want to work on different things. They get sick of working on the same features repetitively. They might have particular career growth goals that they want. So we'll kind of shuffle around people with that. And the heads of each discipline kind of track all of that and work with who's going on what. Effectively, this gives us a detailed resourcing guide for who's actually doing what. So here's kind of an example of our roadmap. It's pretty dense. It's actually only a snapshot. Our full roadmap is probably twice the size of this. But up the top, we kind of track what are our kind of key features that are releasing week over week. And then down below, we track all of the different devs allocated to each feature. I'll go into a bit more details what each of the individual, I guess, sections are on it coming up. But I guess the important things here for us is that on this, the green features are actually things that are locked in, and the grey features are things that we've kind of just put in as tentative planning, and yellow things are just like, all right, we'll put this in here because we think we've got some space for it, and this is something that person wants to work on. It's just color-coded to make it easier for us to track. All of the red stuff is just when things are about to come out soon for a release, and we put it on there to remind us, this is when it actually has to be done by, well, this is what we're aiming to be done by. At the low level, on the individual features or in those sub-teams, we split it into 6 phases, which kind of fall under these 3 headings. And I'll go a bit more into the details of each. So the brief phase, everything on every feature on Battle Pirates has to have a brief. We have to have a document describing what's actually involved in that feature. The goals of that feature, why are we building this? The goals are very important because if you do decide to change the feature or if you're iterating, you want to make sure that the changes and iterations match back to what you actually were intending to achieve. The design of it, how is it actually meant to operate? User stories is something that we're emphasizing a lot more these days to cover all of those kind of different flows that you expect. They're very critical for people actually implementing things as well, we find. Engineers need to know what do you actually expect to behave in each, or how do you expect it to behave in each of these different scenarios. And then in the brief, we also kind of plan our loose asset requirements, such as art. Usually it's additional content for prizes, that kind of thing. A lot of our art is fairly streamlined. Once we've got the brief written by that feature owner, the individual who's gone off and written it, we'll have all of our discipline heads review it. And at this point, what we're trying to do is make sure it has all of the information for that particular discipline. We try to avoid handing briefs onto the individual people implementing it until we're sure that it's kind of got all of those questions answered. Otherwise, it just wastes that person's time. And this way, it's also good for all of the discipline heads to kind of know what we're intending to build as well. We catch out a lot of things when I review something, and it'll be actually, you know, a system that design is intending to use doesn't behave the way that they expect. They might think, oh, well, this is only going to be a small feature. I'll just piggyback on the back of how this particular ship works, and it might not work at all that way. So we catch a lot of things there and kind of refine it. Once we've got that kind of refinement and that sign-off stage is when it goes onto that roadmap that I showed you, the swag, the staff allocation. And once we've allocated the staff, that's when we actually send it off to the engineers and artists and designers working on it. We send it off to them early, hopefully before they're supposed to start work, give them time to review it themselves, ask any questions that they have, and really kind of let it sink in before we actually expect people to start work. And that's really crucial, we find, for giving people an opportunity to really know what or get an idea of what they're planning to build. Once we've done all that and we're ready to start work, we have a kick-off meeting for this, which is we get all of the people on the team or that sub-team in a room, and we just go through the entire brief. And surprising the number of times when people say, you know, this is what we're going to build, and the engineers are like, all right, this is what I'm anticipating building, and they don't align at all. When we have all of those people in the room together, we can really eliminate a lot of that confusion. After that phase, we move into our task specification, which is the engineers and other people involved. We go off and write all of our tasks out. It's a big, long list, goes into a document. They put estimates on things. We don't require people to be particularly precise on them. In general, we find people are about 75% accurate on estimates. Some people are better at estimating than others. We actually make a fair effort to work with people to improve those estimates. We break things down into 4-hour tasks or 1 to 4 hour tasks. Really what we're looking for is kind of discrete deliverable things that the person can say, this is done. We often find if tasks are over 4 hours that the person hasn't really thought through what they're actually going to do, and it could vary, you know, greatly from 16 hours or 2 days or less. At this point, a lot of the active discussion about how we're actually going to build it should occur. This is the planning phase. Engineers will go off and do their class diagrams, UML, whatever they want to do. We're actually pretty flexible in how people build out their designs. What we really care about is, do they have that complete task list? So it's kind of filled out by all of the individual people on the team. And then once we've got that back, it can take up to a week depending on the size of the feature they're working on. We have a review meeting, which is, again, we put everybody in the room and we look over it and say, is this delivering what we want? Occasionally we'll run a full task list and the designer will say, hey, what about this particular part of the feature? You know, where is this part? And then we'll have to go off and add that to the task spec again. Importantly, this step is the go, no go. So we've kind of, at this point, we'll have put everything on the roadmap in terms of swag, but we might find that something that I guessed was 3 weeks of client work actually turned out to be 5. So we'll put the people in the room and we'll decide, can we cut part of this to hit the date that we need to? You know, can we assign more staff? Can we break down the feature now that we've got a complete task list? Or do we have to move the release date? And it's important to have that discussion, because if you don't actually discuss and say, if this doesn't fit, what are we changing? If you just try and push ahead, that's when you obviously end up missing your dates. We also at this point discuss what are we prioritizing first particularly for large features. If things are running over 4 or 5 weeks or more, we'd say something. We'll work out what are we delivering in the first week, what are we prioritizing to unblock people as well. Design might want something they're actually tuning. And all of this gets converted into tasks that we put into Jira, or I'm sure you're familiar with a variety of different task tracking things. At this point we enter our development phase. It's Scrum-like. Feature work is for us is all done in branches separate from our trunk things, so that everybody's working on it in their own environment. They go off as a team and build those things. We have daily stand-ups where people check in on those features. We use the effectively Scrum-like questions of what did you do yesterday, and what are you working on now, and blocked on anything. At that point we're just looking, is this person still on track for what we've kind of decided to deliver for that week, or are they on track to deliver by the actual deadline, and making sure that they're not just twiddling their thumbs and waiting on things. The target for this phase is dev complete, which is not a shippable thing. This is when the engineers and designers are kind of finished. They've loosely tested it and they're ready to kind of show everyone, which will then pass into our iteration phase. Now, we actually add this as a pad on top of the task spec. So the task spec might come in at saying 3 weeks. We'll have an extra week or so for iteration, and we kind of dynamically determine that depending on either the complexity of the feature, the overall size that we've already allocated to it, but it works out to be roughly a quarter of the time, or a quarter to a third of the time that we've actually allocated for people to work on that feature. At this point we do a feature review. We get everybody to sit down, walk through it. Is it what we actually intended? If there's anything we want to change, we make sure it's tracked, and we determine whether we can actually do it. We unleash our QA, which is when they go off and find all of the edge case bugs. It's important, as it's mentioned here, that we lock the primary development down at this point. Occasionally we've let QA onto features early, and you often end up with a bunch of bugs going in that are really just like, this isn't implemented yet. Kind of issues, and it's a waste of everyone's time, because then the engineer has to look at those tickets and just close them, or end up with duplicates and that kind of thing. We also track a burn down as well at this point, which is we're tracking the number of tasks that we've got left, how quickly we're getting through them, and how close we are to actually hitting our target. Burn downs will generally give you a reasonable estimation of if you're actually going to hit things or not. At the end of this phase, we'll also integrate this feature back into trunk, which it goes in with all of our other features. It's important this actually is tracked as a step for us as well, because sometimes when you're building something on a separate branch, when you end up integrating it with something else that someone else has worked on, you end up with bugs that are introduced just by overlap of what those people are working on. Sometimes merging those conflicts can actually be quite time-consuming and complicated, so we make sure we allocate time for that as well. So, at that point we have what we call a release candidate. All of our features are locked, they're in trunk, we cut a branch off from trunk, and that's what we actually want to put out in live. Now this is actually a full week before we're intending for it to go live. And that is because often we find in that time, by having that kind of soak period, occasionally we'll run into issues just by virtue of those features being in the trunk thing, and people and QA testing things. They might find like real edge case issues. Or other performance issues or something like that. And we will sometimes fix critical issues. We don't do anything, we try not to do anything other than critical issue fixes at this point, otherwise you just risk introducing more problems. During this phase we'll also prepare a rollout plan, which could involve database migrations, that kind of thing, table structure. We'll also run through our release checklist. This is another really critical step for us, which effectively has like a whole pile of simple questions. Has X been done? Have we copied this data across from here to there? Has the lead designer signed off on the final tuning for things? It's important that we actually run through that release checklist and check it off before we deploy to live to catch those kind of small bugs. You'd be surprised. And I would highly recommend reading a book called The Checklist Manifesto. It describes how these things are checklists were used to significantly improve results for doctors and various industries. So at this point, usually we don't actually have a lot of work for the developers and people working on the feature anymore. Ideally, they shouldn't be working on this feature anymore. So we usually in this phase have them working on the planning for the next one. We try and avoid overlapping the RC, the release candidate period, with the actual any development work for future features, because if something does crop up, we need them to come back to it. So, and it doesn't matter too much if we cut into planning time, we find. And the good thing is that release candidate provides us with like a warning buffer. We know that if we get right up to the Friday when we're about to cut this, if we're still working on things, that we're probably not going to be done in time. But it gives us that extra week to kind of decide, as opposed to how we used to historically work, which is right up to the day before the actual release. And you'd find people stuck there at about 6 or 7 o'clock at night on the Wednesday before a Thursday release, and people were saying, well, actually, maybe we can't get this done. So by having the release candidate period, we can actually look at it then and say, is this actually ready to go out in the next release? Obviously, with a live game, another thing to consider is that you have live support. When you push something out, you get bugs. This change is inevitably going to introduce bugs. As much as we try and avoid it through a strong QA period, you'd be surprised what you have when you've got thousands of users playing your game, what they can find. That can also be not just engineering bugs, but also design bugs. Sometimes they combine things in particularly interesting ways, and we'll have content that we put out that was supposed to, I guess, slightly escalate PvP, and then a bunch of players run around beating all of the other players up with it. So we have to be prepared to kind of make changes to live and react to that. So we try and, again, make sure that the team is aware that that's going to happen. As mentioned here, complexity of the feature. For some really complex major features, say we've spent 6 weeks to a month building a new event system, when that event first runs, we have all of that, the members of that team actually on site and in a room, which we call the war room, to effectively deal with any issues that come up, so that we've got the core people who can review what a problem is and make a decision about how we want to fix it quickly without involving or interrupting the rest of the team. So just to go back again and kind of cover that's kind of the phases that we go through. The first two tend to be quite, the planning phase can be quite extensible, flexible, moves back and forth. We start people early on that if we can. The development phase is really the one that we try and lock down, that tells us if we're actually going to deliver things on time. And then that release phase is that buffer, that sanity check for these things. So what is the strengths of our particular approach? Because we have this multi-layered approach, we can kind of see things coming from a distance, what we're working on. We know whether we have the resources to work on things far in advance. But we also have, because we break things down into individual sub-teams with feature leads on those, we can quickly adapt on a small level without it impacting the rest of the team. And I think that's critically important, to actually have that split into the small teams, so that you can avoid that kind of chaos of everybody being dragged into work on things. Occasionally, when people finish up early as well, we can pull them in to help on fixing bugs or miscellaneous issues. And a lot of the miscellaneous bugs that do crop up, the tech debt, things that are just long running, people just work on them in those iteration phases, because we have that bandwidth there when possible. So what problems do we run into? So occasionally we'll set ourselves a hard deadline before we've done the preparation. From that, I have a standard commentary. When someone asks me how long it takes something to build, when they say, we've got this new idea, how long will it take? I always say 6 weeks. That is the minimum amount of time for us, or generally that's the largest feature that we develop. And it's kind of a reminder to people to go out and actually build out a proper brief of what they want us to build. Inadequate preparation, again, if people haven't written everything that they actually want, sometimes people writing a brief aren't really interested in writing a long and complicated brief, so they'll take shortcuts or not put everything in. The problem with that is then when you get into development phase, you have changes as you look at something and realize that what you've originally briefed doesn't actually achieve what your goals were. So that's why we have that strong focus on the sign-off from the leads team for reviewing the briefs. Every now and then we get carried away. We think our process is going so wonderfully we don't need to have meetings. People skip those meetings, or we don't book them, and then we get halfway through development and someone will say, wait, hang on, I thought we were doing this. So it's kind of really important to make sure that you're syncing that sub-team up. The people who are involved in the feature actually in the room together, not just in a Slack channel or something like that talking. They need to actually communicate and discuss these things. Scope creep can occasionally be a problem. Halfway through development, we'll have a designer go and talk to an engineer and say, hey, I've got this great idea. What if it did this? And then all of a sudden the engineer gets really excited. That sounds like a great idea. I'm going to go and implement that. They don't put tickets to track that work in. We find out the next day at the next stand-up, or they don't mention it. And it says, well, what have they been working on? This new thing. Hang on, but we don't actually have time to do that. So there's a strong emphasis for us with the daily stand-ups to kind of track what people are working on. And again, to make sure we've got tickets tracking everything. You need to be tracking all of your work for those burn down charts to make sure that you're actually on track to hit the deadlines. Okay, another problem you might run into is misidentifying needs versus wants. This is when someone says this is crucial to the feature, or we have to release this in a couple of weeks to hit a particular deadline. Sometimes we don't actually need to do that. They just really want us to do that. It might be valuable, but it's not critical to the team. So you have to be aggressive sometimes in really looking at something and saying, do we actually need to do this? And then the last thing we have is that sometimes we have to make aggressive changes at the last minute for features. And at that point, you really have to make sure you're reviewing what the changing requirements are. And again, tracking that work. The other problem for us is large features. We don't do them a whole lot. Anything that's going to take multiple months generally doesn't fit as well into our process because we're so fine-tuned. In general, most of our work does actually fit into our process because we have that live game. We're not building massive prototypes. But occasionally we do what we call a tentpole feature. We limit ourselves to one tentpole feature per quarter. That is because by their very nature, they tend to be quite nebulous in terms of time taken to development. And if you've looked into waterfall approaches to process management, generally waterfall does not work well for big planning things. So the aspects of our process that we use kind of waterfall can be tricked there. As I said, because we have that live game, we're not building to one release once every 3 months or something like that. We're actually building to a release every single week. So we favour predictability because we need to release content. Users will not be engaged if they don't have something to come back to. So we make sure that we always have stuff targeting every week. And as such, we focus on prioritise the features that are actually going to be able to fit in. We find development tends to be a bit of a roller coaster. At the peak, everything's running really well. We're following our process. We're hitting all of our deadlines. As I said, we start to get relaxed sometimes. Maybe we'll skip meetings. We don't need to have this meeting. I don't need to fill out the release checklist. The process seems painful. People will start to skip the important things, tracking tasks, being precise in their estimates, and then we kind of fall back down into this trough. And usually when we get to that, the trough is pretty predictable because we're looking at things and we're eating into our RC week, regularly, or missing dates or having a whole lot of bugs on live. And usually you can kind of see the trend that heads towards that. And at that point, we kind of make sure we focus back on our actual process and stick to it. But it tends to oscillate quite a lot because the big problem is good process is generally unnoticeable because everything's just going to plan. No one thinks, why is it going to plan? Everyone just says, everything's going to plan. It's great. When things go wrong, it's very obvious. And consequently, we have like the leads group meeting weekly to discuss a lot of how we're tracking and make sure we're trending well, sticking to these things. So my recommendations for your own process. Everybody's got different requirements of what they're needing to build towards. So for me, an important one is this process is guidelines, not rules. You need to be flexible. If a process is too rigid and holding you back, if you're missing success or missing opportunities, then you need to cut back on it. I highly recommend you split between the planning for long-term and short-term. Make sure you actually allocate time for both of those because it's very easy to get caught up in short-term planning. As I said, we built a feature, focused, and then we come out and find out that we've got a whole pile of features and it needed to be released in the next 2 weeks and we haven't actually planned for them. So we make sure that we split between that long-term planning and the short-term planning. It's important for your process to have goals other than success or just deliverables. Your process isn't just about saying, oh, we're able to hit this particular, release these things pretty regularly. What you actually want is team health still good? Are people happy about what they're working on? Are we letting people move around and build their skill sets? And all of that needs to be factored into how you structure, how you build your particular games. And then importantly, adapt to your team. There is no silver bullet for process development. If you read into a lot of Agile, it might not necessarily be applicable to how you're building things. Scrum, daily stand-ups might not work for your team if you have a lot of remote staff. Really customize it to what works best for your team. And the reason I say this is that if your team isn't comfortable with how you do things, they won't follow the process. You'll make them upset, or they won't be following it and you won't be hitting what you need to do. And a bad process is worse than no process. And then the last important thing is that I think a good project manager is in service to their team, not to any one discipline. What I mean by that is it's very common for project managers to actually be a part of, say, the product manager team. And in that case, they're kind of focusing on saying, oh, do we have something coming out every week? They don't really, then they lose track of what does it actually take to build these things. The flip side of that is if they're working closely with the engineering team and not really caring about what your deliverables are on a weekly basis, that they might really, they're just looking at resourcing, but they might be missing out on important things like actually making sure you have stuff coming out every week for a live game. So last, we're actually hiring more people in San Francisco and Melbourne, if anybody's interested. My contact details here if anyone has any further questions. And does anyone have any questions? Start front.
So in the chart that you showed earlier on with the blocks laid out on the project timeline.
That one?
Much earlier than that.
This one?
I noticed on there that you set time aside for tech debt. I was wondering whether, like how commonly that actually happens in your process and what kind of tasks you're trying to accomplish in it.
It's probably maybe once a month we'll have like small features creep in. It's really identifying like issues that are kind of long-standing, or you look at your error logs. Maybe there's an error in your error logs that's not catastrophic. Users aren't actually affected by it. But if all of those things aren't addressed, they build up over time. So we make sure we actually put some time in to kind of allocate an engineer to deal with that specific problem. Sometimes it's also time to investigate something. Maybe we're using MongoDB and we think that we might want to introduce Redis or something on the back end. So we'll actually allocate time for people to go in and prototype that kind of stuff. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
So you have like a week buffer for the release candidate. What happens if something critical happens or you get a bug and you don't release out? Does everything else get pushed back?
Generally not, because everybody's working in the sub teams, and because of the buffer is like a full week, and most of our features fit between 4 to 6 weeks. A full week is pretty quite a lot of time to move things around. And if I go back to this one, you'll also see that there's a lot of we have approximately 10 engineers, I believe. So there's a lot of people always available or rolling off one feature and onto the next one. So at that point, it becomes a discussion with the heads of the discipline about who's the appropriate person to jump in and help. Occasionally, we have to move things out, but usually we can move someone over and have them help on a particular issue. And that's why this particular roadmap part is one of the more crucial things for us, because it shows like who is available. I can just fire this up at any time and say, what are people working on? Or if something comes up and people are like, hey, there's a particular holiday coming up, we should do something related to that holiday for the game. We can easily look at this straight away and say, oh, I've got space. I can allocate people to it. So it lets people fit into things. Oh, well, Neil?
Firstly, how is the game monetized, and does that affect the features that you're doing? Like, how well it is monetized, and does that affect what features you end up doing?
Yeah, as a free-to-play game, monetization is crucial to us. We track all of that. The game monetizes by players effectively paying to earn new content, the usual free-to-play mechanics. We do track revenues kind of tracked by our product managers, and that does impact a lot of what we're working on. But because PMs and designers are working on the features, they kind of work together to kind of make sure that we've got a balance between hitting our revenue targets and making sure that we've actually got interesting and engaging content for users, tracking the game health for the players and not just what can they pay for. Over there.
Sorry. I was just going to ask, so on your roadmap planning, I'm seeing that you've got engineers all logged out there. Are your artists also working in that kind of way, or? Yep.
So I made a small sample of this, as I said, with approximately 20 to 30 people on the team. It can be quite big. We actually break them into separate sheets in our planning. They're tracked by the heads of the discipline, because the head of the discipline really knows who's the best person to work on something, based off the complexity of it and, again, what that person's interested in. So we track all of that. Our art's usually done much further in advance to the actual development. They work on a slightly different cadence.
We found with our artists that they really hate working at the same speed programmers are. So they
Yep.
usually work on the stuff ahead of the programmers, and then the programmers just work with
Yeah, our content's pretty predictable. So we actually rigorously make sure that our art pipeline, or what we request from art, is well done in advance. And because we're a content-driven game, if art makes too much content for us, it means we don't need the content late. We can just use it later. It's not a problem. Do you have a question?
I actually had two. Really greedy. How do you time box the planning period? What is too much planning? What is right now planning?
We generally have a number of meetings. We usually it probably comes out to about 4 one-hour meetings with the heads of the discipline, and we'll spread that over 1 to 2 weeks. And it's important that everybody's involved in that and kind of has buy-in to those meetings. If people aren't, I guess if design's not really paying attention, then product might have a whole lot of heavily monetizing features that kind of breaks up game health. So it's really important that everybody's involved in that.
And my other question was regarding the iteration period. What are the programmers doing while QA is happening and why review is happening? Is it bugs getting reported in real time and they're dealing with them, or is it?
Yes. So the end of each thing is pretty nebulous. So we track things. This is on a per week basis. We put all of our features, we block it out in weeks, because we don't bother blocking it down to the day or the hour, because it's so random. If you spend a lot of time focusing on that, you won't actually, it'll fluctuate a lot and it's not really valuable. So in that time, usually straight away the devs will say, hey, I've finished with everything. QA, have a look at it. There's usually, that'll come up in stand-up, because it'll be, how are you tracking towards our weekly goal, our Friday goal? And the dev will be like, I'm done, and we're ready to go to QA, and then QA will immediately start on it. So our devs are also, we remind everyone, if you finish, if you run out of work, let your lead engineer know, because then the lead engineer was going to look at it and say, all right, I need someone else to work on this, or here's a bunch of miscellaneous tasks that I need you to work on. So they'll just move on to whatever we need them to. I think you'll find that in general there's more work to be done than there is people to do it.
The grid you just had up there, are you just doing that in Excel, or do you have some other tools for that?
We use Google Sheets. We use Google Drive for pretty much all of our document tracking, the main advantage being that it's always available in the cloud, so people can access it anywhere.
The second question too, so with the miscellaneous stuff, which branch do you do in that? Do you have a miscellaneous branch, do you have a feature branch?
It depends what it's related to. It depends how urgent it is. So if it's a particularly complex, anything that might touch, say, a risky area of the code, the developer will just cut a new branch, do it in the branch, and then the good thing about a lot of that is we'll do things sometimes where we just cut a branch, do the work, and if QA is particularly busy, it just sits there, and then when they get around to it, we put it on one of our dev environments, and the QA will then look at it at some point, sign off, and we'll just merge it back down. And we track it by all of our tickets or tasks that people have worked on are tracked by release. So we know everything that we're intending to put in that release. And with MISC work, if QA doesn't get to it, we can always just push it another release. Occasionally we do things in trunk. don't advise it. On the front again.
You mentioned if people aren't very good at estimating, that you'd work with them to improve their estimates. I'm wondering if you had any tips or methods that was used to help.
Usually we would review the task spec. So if I have engineers who've come up with a task spec and say on average they're varying wildly, I'll sit down with them and go through the task spec after we've done it and say, this one turned out to be much more complex than you anticipated. How could you have actually, in hindsight, how would you have approached it? In general, as I said, most people are about 75% accurate. We actually work to what we call like a 6-hour workday. So everything's broken down in hours, but we keep a 2-hour buffer every day for meetings, all of that kind of stuff. Engineers also have to do code reviews. There's all of the miscellaneous stuff that crops up, so we make sure that we're actually kind of padding our days for that stuff.
Who manages prioritization of the roadmap?
Generally, the actual releases are managed by design and the product managers. They work together. Product is the one that's most tracking the data and everything that we're getting feedback from users. So they're generally the ones saying this is when we need to release this. Design, again, is kind of health when they're looking at the game and saying, okay, this, players are kind of getting bored doing this particular repetitive task. Let's insert new content there to kind of mix things up. So between design and product, they kind of do it. And then engineering does have a say in that. We generally will propose new systems as necessary. I'll admit that engineering generally takes a backseat to most of the roadmap planning, but we have the quarterly planning. We can put it in there. I think the important thing for your different heads is to be able to justify the value of what they're proposing people to work on. Whether that's actually going to make it easier for future development of that feature, reduce bugs, reduce server overhead, all of those kind of things. If you can actually quantify the impact of something, you're more likely to be able to get it into the roadmap. Any other questions? In the front again.
Especially since you mentioned the importance of people being able to meet in person to organise things, I was wondering how your process is changed or impacted by some of your team being remote.
Yeah, so the main person who's remote is me. I worked with the team for 3 years, so they on site, so they're fairly familiar with me. So we use Slack and we used to use Skype, but a lot of messaging apps, and we use rooms for each of the individual features that are in development, so it's very easy to see what you're involved in, and people just get video called into meetings. Any time we have a meeting, we make sure that we have omnidirectional mics so that you can actually pick up everybody who's in a meeting and coordinate with those people. It generally works pretty well. The biggest impact we have is obviously the time difference between San Francisco and Melbourne. But we can work around that pretty well. I actually find it's quite nice because at about 12 o'clock in the afternoon, the San Francisco team finishes their day, and then I have all afternoon to do what I want to do. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much. I hope that you got something from my talk.